Welcome to Take or Give, the podcast where we give you a backstage pass to the foreign aid and international development sector. We want to explain exactly how things really work beyond what you might see on TV or what you might read in the headlines or on social media. My name's Lorriann. I'm the founder and director of a political consultancy called the Advocacy Team.
And I'm Alex. I'm an independent researcher, advocate, and actor working in the sector.
Together, we are your co-hosts. Alex and I have worked in the development sector for many years in many countries and in many different types of roles. So we have a good sense by now of how the sector works, and we want to share some of that with you. And we actually met 8 years ago. We were both raising our hands and asking questions in the same plenary at a major international development conference in London. And this was a conference that took place a few weeks after what became known as the Oxfam scandal made headline news. You might remember that at least one employee from Oxfam had been found to have abused his position and was accused of sexually exploiting young women in Haiti in and around the time of the devastating earthquake that had hit Haiti. And at this conference, this was one of the first times that the other leaders, chief executives of the big INGOs were going to speak publicly about this topic. And so many of us were excited and to hear what they would say and what this scandal would mean for change across the sector, because there were strong suggestions that what happened at Oxfam could also have happened in other charities. And I have to say that I was left feeling at best underwhelmed by the response. And the reason being is what we heard is probably quite typical of development. We heard about technical solutions. And so the idea seemed to be that what we need to do is to look again at our policies and procedures around safeguarding. We need to hire more safeguarding consultants. We need to have new forms and processes and procedures for people to kind of complete and to tell us that they are committed to certain principles and certain values, and that this was a technocratic exercise. And if we could get the policies and the technocratic steps in place, that was how we were going to respond to it. And there seemed to be no willingness to engage with all of the big political issues that were so obvious to some of that. So all of the issues about the status and power that is wielded by a senior European development worker from a very well-resourced, rich charity operating in a country that is going through a devastating time and crisis. The sort of power that that person holds, the responsibility that that person holds, and how that power can be abused and manipulated. And there seemed to be no willingness at that time to engage with any of those issues. And so I think I and a number of others emerged from that conference hall just feeling disappointed and a little bit disillusioned, but that disillusionment did not last. We found others who had similar thoughts, and a few of us did what outraged women around the world have done historically, which was?
That's right, we joined a book club. So this one was called the Anti-Racism Book Club. That's a term that's no longer in vogue, but it's still something we care deeply about. And during this, the time of this book club, we read some absolutely incredible books with a beautiful group of people. So if any of you are listening, hello, and just know how much we miss the group and what a huge effect it's had on us to this day. And also, we got to know each other pretty well. And that led to us working together on several different projects over a number of years for lots of different type of organizations, foundations, charities, and others. And then one day we thought, back to what Lorriann was saying, none of this is really getting at the heart of the issues around power and privilege and race and gender inequality and more. And so we decided to embark on the next stage of our journey, which was to found the Equity Index. So the Equity Index is a social enterprise. It's based right here in the UK, where we live. And it basically advocates for greater equity in the aid and development sector. And just to put it very simply, all we mean by that is that British aid and development organizations working in other countries, other people's countries, should be held to account over how fair they are being in the ways that they work with other partners and also with the people that they're ultimately supposed to be serving or whose lives they're supposedly trying to improve. And I have to say, this podcast, Lorriann, feels like quite a natural evolution in our journey, because now, rather than taking our messages to people in the sector, we want to speak directly, well, to you, to the listeners, to a public audience who may have very little or even actually no exposure to aid and development whatsoever.
So with that, welcome to Series 1. So in Series 1, we are going to bust some of the key myths that circulate about international development. We are going to outline what some of these myths are. We'll explain why they exist. We'll explain and why we ultimately think that they are false.
So this podcast is for anyone, and we mean anyone, who's interested in a behind-the-scenes take on aid and development, whether you know anything about it or not. And honestly, if you've never heard anything substantial about aid and development, this podcast is made for you, because we're going to be breaking down and explaining lots of different terms and issues. So if you perhaps already work in the sector, you might be wondering, well, is this for me? We think you'll also benefit. Come join the community. Come with us as we challenge the sort of mainstream narratives that you hear most often about development. So we think you'll all benefit hugely from listening, and we are so glad that you've joined us.
Now, we get it. Everyone under the sun has a podcast in 2025. 2026. And so it means that when we had the idea, we thought long and hard, we ummed and ahed, we said, should we do it? Should we not? And ultimately we said, yes, let's do it. Because, we felt that probably no one was going to pay us to do this. So this was a project that we would need to kind of fund ourselves and to do it ourselves. And we were in a position to do that. And secondly, because ultimately there are so many misconceptions, mistruths, half-truths that prevail about the development sector. I find myself spending so much time on Facebook correcting narratives. I find myself so many times with family and friends saying that this is not true and this doesn't work this way and this doesn't work this way. And so I know that the story that's told to the public about international development sector is incomplete at best, and it's inaccurate at worst. And so this is an opportunity to tell a different story, at least from our perspective.
Yeah, totally agree, Lorriann. And in fact, honestly, there are so many myths about the development sector that we've literally devoted Series 1 to debunking, 3 of the ones that we hear most often in our work. There are many, many more, so hopefully stay tuned for future series. But yes, basically we see ourselves as fearless mythbusters, giving you, our audience, the tools you need to say, hey, did you know, with confidence at gatherings with friends, during work meetings, or even at a family reunion or two. So in this episode, which is our very first one, we'll be giving you a breakdown of everything that's been in the news recently about aid and development. And, well, trust us, it's been a lot more than usual.
Yeah, so there has been one big news story about development. I think that there's very few people who don't know that aid budgets have been cut in the UK, that aid budgets have been cut in the US. So in this episode, we want to just explain a little bit more about the context of those cuts. We want to talk a little bit about the reaction to the cuts in some of the countries that will be affected. And then we want to just ask, what does all of this mean for the future of development spending?
That's right. So, let's start with some of the biggest headlines. You may have read that earlier in 2025, Donald Trump made the biggest cuts to foreign aid in real terms of any other so-called donor country. So USAID, that is the US government's development agency, was one of the first victims of Elon Musk. Do you remember Doge? The Department for Government Efficiency? Yes, that's correct. The world's richest man made it his first priority in government to cut the department that was funding programs for those with least access to resources. Let that one sink in. So until that point, the US had been the world's largest aid donor, and they contributed, this is mega, they contributed $61.8 billion in 2024. But then after Trump's inauguration, cuts were announced of around 92% to that figure.
But it wasn't just the US who made this move, and leaders on the other side of the pond saw the decisions taken by the US and decided to follow suit. And there are lots of reasons and arguments about the timing and why that is. But ultimately, Keir Starmer made a very similar decision. So the Labour government, having promised in its election manifesto to return the aid budget, to increase the aid budget as soon as it was fiscally possible to do so, slashed the aid budget to levels not seen since the 1990s. And alongside the UK, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Sweden have also cut their aid budgets to varying degrees. And for a while, it looked like Canada was holding the fort. But Carney and Trump are aligned on very few things these days. But this is one issue where they seem to have been aligned. And even Canada announced cuts of 2.7 billion Canadian dollars to its aid budget. So what does all this mean? It means, taken together, that the huge amounts of money that had previously been available for development spending will no longer be available. And I'm old enough to remember watching BBC documentaries of Michael Burke on the BBC News talking about the AIDS crisis in Africa, talking about a whole generation of children who are at risk of losing their parents and becoming AIDS orphans. And we don't see those headlines anymore. And there's a reason for it. It's because the world came together in a concerted effort to deal with the AIDS crisis. And they did that in part by rich countries providing some of the financing that would be needed to bring down the costs of HIV medicines so that people could live longer, investing in prevention programs for the most at-risk groups, having ambitious targets and effective programs to prevent mother-to-child transmission. So this is a story that our generation should really know that where we made huge progress. And so when these budgets are slashed, these are the sorts of programs that are at risk. The Lancet, which is one of the most respected medical journals, estimates that as a result of just the US aid cuts alone, 14 million additional deaths are now expected by 2030, and that includes 4.5 million children under 5.
I mean, that's staggering. And so we really want you to keep this reality in mind as we continue on with this podcast. And we also want you to remember that this is only part of the story. Okay, we are very much holding two truths at the same time. So we don't want to diminish in any way the impact these cuts have had on the lives of people all around the world as we speak, in some cases to absolutely devastating effect. But if we pull back the curtains just a little bit further, we see that actually the entire system was built on sand. So for instance, why is the US government providing the majority of health funding for multiple countries around the world in the first place? And honestly, even more importantly, how is it that a system that funded these programs that millions of people had come to rely on day to day, came crashing down, quite literally at the click of a finger? And this is the part that really gets me. How could a small group of unelected men whether that be Morgan McSweeney in Downing Street here in the UK or Elon Musk in Washington in the US, how could they take decisions that impact literally millions of people, but with zero accountability?
And what does accountability even mean in international development? So for the people who find that their clinics are closed, or that their food programs have stopped, or that the supplies distributed in refugee camps have been massively diminished, who do they complain to? How do they vote? They don't get to vote with their feet, and they don't get to select who's going to be the development minister at the ballot box. And so this is the big paradox at the heart of the development sector, because there are people who sincerely believe that donor countries have a responsibility and even an obligation, particularly people who come from a religious persuasion will say that it is an obligation on the rich to help the poorest people. And just to exemplify this, let's listen to a clip by former Prime Minister Theresa May criticising Rishi Sunak, who at the time was Chancellor of the Exchequer, about the first set of cuts to the UK aid budget.
With GNI falling, our funding for aid was falling in any case. To reduce it from 0.7 to 0.5% is a double blow. This isn't about palaces for dictators and vanity projects. It's about what cuts to funding mean: that fewer girls will be educated, more girls and boys will become slaves, more children will go hungry, and more of the poorest people in the world will die. I have been in this House for nearly a quarter of a century. During that time, I have never voted against a three-line whip from my party. As Prime Minister, I suffered at the hands of rebels. I know what it is like to see party colleagues voting against their government. We made a promise to the poorest people in the world. The government has broken that promise. This motion means that promise may be broken for years to come. With deep regret, I will vote against the motion today.
So what is the ultimate logic and motivation behind these beliefs? As the name of our podcast suggests, is it really about giving without also taking, especially with cuts this deep? Because this time around, the cuts have been really deep and they've been really significant. And given what we set out earlier about the real life impact of these cuts, I think our next step, Alex, should be to ask, well, what has been the response to the aid cuts in the countries where the cuts have taken place? And the response surprised me. So let me share a few with you. So around the time of the cuts, President Kenyatta of Kenya was addressing a group of health experts in East Africa. And he said, and I quote, "I saw some people the other day crying that Trump has removed funding. It is not your government nor your country. Why are you crying? He has no reason to give you anything. You don't pay taxes in America. This is a wake-up call for you to know what you'll do to support yourselves. So let's work together and bring an end to that." And the president of Zambia told the Financial Times that cuts in aid were long overdue, and that's a quote, and would force countries like his to take care of our own affairs. Sounds counterintuitive. We hear Theresa May almost on the verge of tears, lambasting the UK for stepping away from its responsibilities to support the poorest. And we hear the leaders of some countries, and it's only some leaders, we have to be clear on that, their reaction has been counterintuitive. How do you explain it? I would offer one explanation, and I think Biggie Smalls gave us a few hints, because remember, Biggie told us more money equals more problems, right? The more money you make, the more problems you have. In the context of international development, the more money you give, the more power you have. And I think what some of these leaders were reacting to was, on the one hand, a genuine need for this funding because they see the impact it can have on programs that are needed, and at the same time a reaction to the power they know is yielded when this, and that comes with the funding.
Well said, Lorriann. It really all does come down to power, doesn't it? But that still begs the question, why are we recording this podcast now? And by now, I mean late 2025, early 2026. Well, the aid and development sector is in crisis, as we've explained, arguably the biggest crisis it's ever faced. So we're at a crossroads because the money is reduced and donors are now taking a step back and asking, what is our role? So fresh off the press, the UK has published what it calls a new approach to Africa, where they say that the UK will move from being a donor to being an investor. But what does that actually mean in practice?
I think it means less grant, more debts. What do you think?
Time will tell, Lorriann. A good prediction, you heard it here first. So as the old saying goes, right, history is just doomed to repeat itself. So if we do not take this moment, and I mean all of us, to truly transform so-called development and the way that it works, well, then a couple of things are just bound to happen, right? So either governments are simply going to eventually restore aid budgets, maybe up to the levels that we've seen in the past, and then just go back to business as usual. You know, and this is all while people are crossing their fingers in hope that another generation of politicians won't simply repeat what we're currently experiencing with the aid cuts. That's one scenario.
Yeah. And there's another scenario where governments will use the language of reform, and they'll use the language of change because they now have to explain what a diminished development program and funding and budget will do. And so they will use the language of change, but you'll find that not a lot changes in practice. And I predict there'll be a lot of management consultancy speak. And I say that as someone who runs a consultancy, where we'll hear that we can do more with less. And history tells us that that is very, very rarely true.
Yeah. And listen, if everything really is just totally fine with the aid and development sector in the way that it currently exists, well, then how come recent data from the World Inequality Report showed, and honestly, buckle up, showed that 0.001% of the world's population, and to put it in context, that's fewer than 60,000 people on our entire planet, Lorriann, they control 3 times as much wealth as the so-called bottom half of humanity. And this is a global problem, okay? Because in almost every region of the world, the top 1% is wealthier than the bottom 90% combined. So all is not well in the current way of doing things. And now really is the time to do things differently. We really are in a global crisis. On the positive side, there is renewed momentum on the streets. We see thousands and thousands of people every year all around the world marching to raise awareness of lots of related issues, but including, for example, the slow progress on fighting the climate crisis. And just in the last couple of years, the thousands and thousands that have protested against the state of Israel's genocidal violence in Gaza, in Palestine. And all of these issues are very deeply connected to what this podcast is talking about. So please join us as we bust some of the most enduring myths that are stopping us from taking much needed action.
So that gives you a flavor of the type of questions that we will be covering and trying to unpack in this series as we try to look a little bit deeper to understand how money, power, and privilege all intersect in this murky world of development. Thank you for listening today. We hope we've whetted your appetite and we appreciate your time.
Look, you've heard it all before, but if you did like what you heard today, or at the very least are mildly intrigued, please subscribe and take a moment to rate the podcast. You can also follow us on Instagram and YouTube. All details will be in the description below.
You've been amazing, and we've been Take or Give.